My name is Rosen Solow. I'm an Israeli-trained attorney. I was almost born in Israel. I went through the system growing up. I started in Gan here, all the way through law school. So I'm Israeli. If I have some mistakes in my English, please excuse me. I'm delighted to be here this evening because too often I find that people embark on real estate transactions without having proper information, without knowing the norms, without knowing what is expected and what is accepted, and because of this lack of information may cause themselves unnecessary grief, aggravation, tension, and sometimes even legal proceedings, but it doesn't need to be this way. Information is the key to a successful real estate transaction, and with proper information and guidance, you will negotiate the optimal agreement and save lots of money. And this evening, I'd like to provide you with this important information. And hopefully, we'll make this process enjoyable and worry-free. I'm sure many of you have heard about the tax reforms in Israel, everything that's going on and the changes with real estate. We're going to try to touch on that as well this evening. In our short talk today, I will discuss the process. I will talk about how to do it right. I will not talk about how to find the hottest new project that is coming up, what is the price of a 4-bedroom apartment. I am not going to talk about where to invest, where to buy, what the right community for you is. For all that, you have your Nefesh guide, and there are realtors, and if you'd like more information on that, I'm happy to provide that as well. But tonight, we would like to discuss the process and how to do it right. Before we begin, I'd like you to keep in mind that the information I'm providing is general information only and should not be regarded as legal advice. If you have any particular questions, please discuss them with an attorney. Before I begin, I'd like to give you a few examples that'll show you how important information really is. I have a client who was preparing to sell his home. He purchased an apartment from a contractor, from a kablan. The size of the apartment was about 150 square meters, which is the equivalent of around 1,500 square foot. And the kablan sold him an additional part, an additional halal, an extra piece to the apartment, which was 170 square meters. So that extra piece more than doubled the size of the apartment. Now, when preparing for the sale, when I investigated the legal status of the property, it turned out that that extra piece that the kablan has sold him was never the kablan's to sell. It didn't belong to him, but it belonged to all the owners of the apartments in the building. And even if it had been the contractor's to sell, according to the zoning plans that apply to that building, that extra piece could not have been incorporated and made into the part of the apartment. Now, these people have invested more than $200,000 into making that extra piece part of their main living area. They put in a kitchen that was partially on the apartment area and partially in the halal area. They divided the halal into separate rooms. They put in granite floors and Anderson windows. The halal is just an extra piece. It's just an extra annex to the apartment. And of course, when it came to selling, it wasn't theirs to sell. So of course, if they would have been properly represented, if they would have known what they were doing, they would have done things differently, and that was a very aggravating experience for them. Another example, bank rates. Banks in Israel are likely to charge a commission for almost any handling that you'd have with a bank. For any payment, transfer, exchange, guarantee, any type of transaction you'll have with a bank, chances are there's some kind of commission for the transaction. Now, of course, banks are a business and businesses are around to make money, and that is okay. But you must know, you must keep in mind that a layman walking into the bank, not knowing that bank commissions may be negotiable and which ones of them can be negotiable, not knowing what is considered a high and low rate, not knowing what fees can be waived completely, will usually pay more than someone walking into the bank, knowing the dollar rate on the date they want to make the exchange, asking. It never hurts to ask. Asking for a break on a commission, especially when we're talking about a very hefty transfer or exchange, when you're bringing a lot of money over. And during real estate transaction, we have a lot of interaction with the bank usually. And let me give you an example of how substantial this fee can be. So on a dollar transfer from a US bank to a bank in Israel, a layman is likely to pay sometimes around 1.5%, whereas someone who negotiates with the banks regularly, someone who like a financial advisor, real estate lawyers who deal with banks regularly, I can usually get my clients a rate of around 0.7%. So on a $500,000 transfer and exchange, the difference is between $7,500 to $3,500. That's a $4,000 difference. Now, many times we're worried about negotiating the nitty-gritty issues of the contract, which is also important. We're going to get into that as well, but we're not aware of how substantial these fees can be and how much of a difference this really can make. Last example before we get down to business. I'll never forget the looks on the faces of a young couple that walked into my office. They purchased an apartment from a contractor, and the construction on the apartment was almost complete. It was completely almost done. This couple understood that the Kablan had a wonderful reputation, and he agreed to give them a substantial discount. They got an excellent price on the apartment. They had many friends who purchased in this project, and they decided they weren't taking a lawyer to support them with the deal. They weren't aware of the fact that for the money that they paid the contractor, he should have provided them with a bank guarantee that would give them a monetary protection in case something should happen to the contractor and he should go bust. They were also not aware of the fact that this money that they paid the contractor should not have been paid the contractor to go into his pocket, but it should have been deposited into a closed account of the project, of this building project, a separate account that was situated in the bank that was financing the project. Now, unfortunately, 2 weeks after they signed their contract, the contractor went bust, and they didn't know what was going to be. They came to me at that point. I told you they started off as a very young couple, and when they came to me, they were already showing a little bit of signs of aging because the situation really took away a lot of, was definitely a cause of grief for them. At the end of the day, they ended up getting their apartment, and as I said, this contractor had a wonderful reputation, and they were very lucky that it turned out that way. For 6 months, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. It turned out okay at the end of the day, but it just was not worth the aggravation. Now, another thing, if we're touching on contractors, on purchases from a Kablan, you should know that the Kablan usually charges around 1.5% plus VAT as a fee to pay for lawyer's fee. It's called a lawyer's fee that he tags on to the purchase price. Now, many times, assuming we understand what a lawyer's fee is, we would assume that the contractor, you're paying him a fee in order to have a lawyer that's going to represent you in this transaction. But unfortunately, that's not the situation. The contractor is tagging on an additional fee, which is basically a fee to the contractor's lawyer. You're paying his lawyer to represent him, to draft the documents for him, and he is representing his interest in the transaction. He is also going to register the property at the end of the day on your name. That's part of the fee you're paying him. Sometimes they even tag on an additional fee in order to finalize the transaction by charging you for plans and sketches and all those other things that theoretically may be tagged in with the lawyer's fees. But you should know that 1.5% lawyer's fee that you're paying the contractor is going to his lawyer. It does not provide you with your own protection. So let's get into the details. Purchasing property in Israel is, for most of us, the most meaningful and significant transaction we'll ever make. In many countries in the world, you usually don't even need a lawyer in order to represent you. There are many countries where it's as simple as purchasing any other asset that you will purchase. In Florida, I hear from people, they just walk in, they purchase an apartment, no big deal. But in Israel, it may be more complicated, and there are several reasons for that, in my opinion. So the first is that it's just a different system. The delegation of responsibility between the buyer and the seller, between the different professionals that are involved in the transaction, the responsibility that the lawyer has in the transaction, the responsibility the realtor has in the transaction, and I will discuss in depth all of these different professionals and what their job is, what their role is in the transaction in a moment. Now, another reason for it is that you are dealing with Israeli bureaucracy. We can't deny it. After working for the government for many years, I worked for Misrad Apnim for many years. I managed the Department of Real Estate and Municipality there. I'd like to let you in on a little secret. Israeli bureaucracy makes no sense, okay? Don't try to fight it. Don't try to understand it, just try to get familiar with it or hire someone who is familiar with it to work on your behalf. The next reason is Israeli culture. Now, there's a tendency of Israelis to come up with a statement, which is part of the mentality and the culture here, to say, "Yeh beseder, al tidag, hakol yeh beseder." People have a lot of hashgacha, everything is going to be fine, why are you so worried, just relax, it'll all be okay, while sometimes neglecting the most crucial issues. And I'd like to give you an example for that. It's a very common phenomenon in Israel that many properties over time just grow. People have larger families, people have need for more space, and they'll add an annex, they'll add an extra porch, they'll add another basement, they'll push out the rooms. Somehow over time the properties grow while neglecting to receive the proper heterei bniya, the building permits that are necessary legally in order to expand your property. Now, there are some municipalities that really will tear down any legal extension right away, but I can tell you that in many other municipalities, that's not the case. And municipalities will allow the seller to live, the owner of the property is not even a seller at that point, to live with these extensions. Many times they'll even charge arnona. They will charge a municipal tax for these illegal spaces. And the municipality is happy because they're gaining taxes, they're gaining money, and everyone is happy and everything seems fine unless a neighbor complains or unless it becomes an issue. But when does it become a major problem? It becomes a major problem at the time of sale. Because when a buyer wants to come and register the property on their name, if they've already signed a contract, at that point they need to provide a document from the municipality that claims that there are no debts on the property, there are no arnona debts, and there's no illegal building. And if there is illegal building, it really becomes a problem with being able to provide that certification. Now, it also becomes a problem, Davi is probably going to get into this more extensively, if you would like to get a mortgage, if you'd like to obtain a mortgage in order to finance your purchase. In a situation like that, if you'd like to get a mortgage, if there is illegal building in the property, then a surveyor sent by the bank, who's going to come and check the value of the property, will value the property at a much lower value than the purchase price. And many times people assume that whatever is written in the contract, they will receive 70% of that, they will receive 50% of that, whatever it is that the bank is willing to approve them for. And if for any reason there's illegal building or the bank decides that it's just not worth what's written in the contract, you just will not be able to get a mortgage for what you plan on receiving. So that becomes an issue. Signing of a real estate contract, of a purchase contract, is the most crucial stage in the whole transaction. And any change or alteration of the contract may cause serious implications and monetary consequences. As opposed to systems like in the United States or elsewhere, where most of the responsibility is shifted from the buyer to the seller at a much later stage, at the stage of closing, when you receive the property, possession. According to the Israeli system, the responsibility is shifted much earlier on, already at the stage of signing of contract. At contract, all the deeds, all the documents assigned between the two parties. Of course, a lot of the documents are held in escrow by the seller's lawyer until all the money is paid in full, but in general, all the documents assigned at that stage. At time of signing of contract, it is very common to pay 15% of the purchase price, and most of the money will be handed to the seller usually before the date of possession. And the tax authorities have to be reported that a deal has been signed 40 days from signing of contract. It is very uncommon in Israel that the seller will allow you to sign a contract and have a contract that is contingent upon different stipulations, that he will allow you to go and check. You sign a contract, you say, I want it at that point, check if I really want it, check if it's good for me, check if it meets my needs. Most sellers in Israel don't work that way. Once you sign, it's a bound deal, and if you change the terms, then you'll be subject to penalties. So let's talk, because of this, we have to make sure that everything is checked before we sign a contract. That is a very important stage. So let's discuss who the professionals are who are involved in the transactions, what checks need to be made, and how we approach it. So the first thing is finding a home. There are many ways to find a home. You can check in newspaper listings. You can check on the internet. Another way is to go to a realtor to help you with receiving with finding a place. What you must know about realtors, which is different than in the United States, realtors will many times present you with a lot of information on the property. They will tell you that you can extend the property in all kinds of directions. They may tell you that the garbage dump that you see across the street is not going to last. It's going to become a beautiful park. They may tell you that there aren't any problems, there aren't any illegalities. They can tell you many, many things. Take everything that you hear with a grain of salt. I will not tell you that there aren't wonderful realtors, because there are, and that some that their reputation is very important to them. But all information that is presented to you, I would recommend that you check, you double check, you triple check with the professionals that are necessary for this. In Israel, there's no concept as title insurance. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of title insurance. Title insurance is an insurance policy that buyers can take in order to make sure that there are no problems, legal problems in the property, to make sure that there are no third-party claims to the property, to make sure that there are no conflicts, no liens, no legal blemishes in the property. In Israel, it is your lawyer's responsibility to make sure that there are no legal problems, and if there should be any problems, I don't know how much I want to tell you this as a lawyer, but it is our responsibility, the lawyer's responsibility in the transaction, to make sure that these problems aren't there, and if they're there, they need to present them to you and explain to you how they're going to be solved. And if we're already talking on the topic of lawyers, so let me give you another situation of how important it is, not just that you get a lawyer, but a lawyer who deals with real estate. You found a perfect home in Israel, your dream home. You tell your parents, your friends, your relatives, I found the perfect home in Israel. I am ready to go ahead with a transaction. Chances are, your relative will tell you, don't continue with the deal before calling your cousin, Shloimi. He's been practicing in Israel for many years. He's a wonderful podiatry lawyer. You must approach him for the deal. So before you rush and call your cousin Shloimi, I'd like to share another situation, another case that I've had. A client, before coming to me, was very interested in purchasing. He actually signed an agreement to purchase in a very upscale project in Ra'anana. In order to help him with the transaction, he went to a very well-known criminal lawyer. I will not name names, but he went to a very well-known criminal lawyer. The criminal lawyer went and did his check in the property. He went to the land authority. That is where the Rashut Mekalkei Israel, it's known today, it's called the Rashut Mekalkei Israel or Minhal Mekalkei Israel in the past. And he checked the title. And according to what it said there, the person who presented themselves as the seller was actually the seller. They did, that looked fine. There didn't seem to be any legal blemishes on the title. He thought the deal was going to be a piece of cake, no problem. And then it turned out they signed the contract. Before making the second payment, it turned out that there was a lien on the property to the tax authority. What this lawyer has not checked, this criminal lawyer, as I said, he did not check the Ministry of Pledges, Rasham HaMashkonot, and in a situation where the registry is in the Ministry of, if the registry is in the land authority and not in the land registry, not in Tabu, in that situation, you have to check another registry. The liens would not be registered on that registry, and this lawyer, who's not an expert in this field, was not aware of that. At that point, these clients came to me, and we were able to negotiate a new deal, and we were able to speak to the tax authorities. The second payment went towards the debt that the owner had in the property, and we were able to resolve it. But it may not end this way. And the moral of the story is always seek representation from a lawyer who specializes in the field that you seek representation. Engineers. Engineers are very important in the purchase process as well. What the engineer will check is that there are no structural problems, there are no leaks, there are no issues with dampness. He has special machinery. A good engineer will be able to put a machine by the wall and check if there's any dampness. He'll see certain cracks. He'll know if those cracks are major or not. And what an architect will do in the process, an architect will check the zoning plans. We gave the example about the property growing over time. What the architect will do is they will check and make sure that the actual physical structure matches whatever appears in the municipality. And besides that, if there are any intentions, sometimes people tell me that they love an apartment just because all of the potential it has, they can close it from here, close it from there. An architect will be able to tell you what can be legalized, what can be made, what can be done in the property in a legal manner. Now, after you've done all of these different inquiries, assuming that you find that there is some kind of blemish in the property, you've done your check, you bought an engineer, you bought an architect, it is very important to determine the nature of the blemish, the nature of the defect that is in the property. If it is a major problem, the architect will tell you this can never be made kosher. My suggestion is just walk away from the property and find something else. But that is not the norm. In most situations, the defects are very minor, and they're usually things that can be fixed. And if that is the situation, then the first thing I would do is I would try to negotiate with the seller to try to have him fix whatever blemishes there are. If there's illegal building, try to get him to deal with the licensing and getting the proper permits in order to make sure that everything is okay. And in most cases, I must tell you, in most cases, the seller won't be willing to fix anything. But at least at that situation, you know the true value of the property, and you're negotiating in a much better way. Because when you know what the worth is, you know what it's worth to you, you know what it's worth to the seller, at that point you will make an offer that actually matches what the property is worth. Financing and mortgages. Now, because of these strict implications, as we said, and the monetary consequences that may follow if we do not assess ahead of time what the deal is going to cost and how we're going to follow through, it is extremely crucial that you determine ahead of time how you're going to finance your purchase and when your money is going to become available to you. Okay? Banks in Israel are likely to finance around 70% of the purchase. If you're not Israeli citizens, 50%. Davi, I'm sure, will extend on all of this. I will not go into his territory. It is very important, though, that you get a preliminary approval in writing from a bank that they are willing to give you a mortgage before you sign a contract. Many times banks will tell you we don't do that until after you sign a contract. The preliminary approval you can get before you sign. There are 2 stages of approval. One is on yourself and one is on the property that you're purchasing. You're going to discuss all of that, so I'm not even going to go into that. What is very important is also to assess when your money is going to become available to you and what currency you would like to pay in. That is something that is very, very important. In Israel, because the shekel is much stronger in the past several years, it is much more likely that sellers will demand that they sign a contract in shekel, but it's not always the situation if you're purchasing from a foreign resident. Sometimes they prefer to receive the money elsewhere in a different currency. If your money is still in dollars, it may pay to just have the money transferred and save yourselves all those commissions and fees that I spoke about. I'll give you an example. I had a client, a young couple again, clients who were fortunate enough to have their father-in-law purchase an apartment for them. Halavai al kulanu, I wish we all had situations like that. And before we signed the contract, I spoke to this young couple who didn't really know much about finances or anything else, and I said to them, try to find out what currency your father-in-law is going to send the money over. And they told me they spoke to him. He said he's going to be transferring the money in dollars. Please negotiate a dollar payment in the contract. And that's what I did. I spoke to the seller, we negotiated, we signed the contract. That is exactly what we did. Comes before the second payment, this client walks into my office with a suitcase full of euros. So first of all, it's shocking when anyone walks in with a suitcase full of money. No one really wants to see that. No one wants to receive it. No one wants it. I have to tell you that banks, more than anything, they hate receiving those bills because it's just a hassle for them. They don't want to deal with the authenticity of the bills. They don't want to have to deal with protecting, with Brinks and all kinds of protections they have to have around money. They don't like dealing with money. When you deposit a lot of cash, they charge a tremendous commission. That's the first issue, but most people don't have that problem. But in terms of the currency itself, in this situation, since we received euro and not dollars, what I had to do is exchange the euro into shekel and then the shekel into dollars, because the currency of payment in this situation, we negotiated dollars. I thought it was going to cost them an arm and a leg. They didn't even realize how much it was going to cost them. And again, we were able to reach a compromise with the seller, and in this situation, he agreed to receive shekels. So we just had to have that one exchange of euro into shekels. But if you know you have dollars and you can negotiate a dollar agreement, that'll be the cheapest way for you to go. Always negotiate an agreement in the currency that you're holding. I have 3 more topics I want to cover. So, as a result of these serious implications, again, of signing of a contract, I want you to keep in mind that you should never sign any document before you have it looked over by a lawyer. Whether it's a memorandum of intention, whether it's some kind of bakasha to some kind of request for a project, some kind of hazmana for shirutim, sometimes I could see all different kinds of headings to these documents. Realtors will present you with documents. Contractors will present you with documents that'll tell you, there's no significance to it, just sign it, it's not a binding contract. Never sign anything, especially if you don't understand what it says, especially if it's not in a language that you speak. I can't warn you enough from signing these documents, and I want to give you an example for this. Very lovely purchaser who's in the stage of hasn't negotiated any deals yet, who's in the beginning of the process of looking for a home. At this stage, he looks in the newspaper, sees an ad for an apartment in downtown Yerushalayim. He decides, I have to start somewhere. It seems like a reasonable price. He goes to look at the apartment. He starts talking to the seller. They seem to have chemistry. The seller knows his relatives. He knows his brother. They start playing Jewish geography. Somehow there's a lot of good chemistry there. And the seller says to him, it's lunchtime. Let's go and have a cup of coffee. We're right down the block from Cafe Rimon. They walk down Ben Yehuda. They sit down in Cafe Rimon. And the seller of the apartment takes his napkin that is sitting under his mug of coffee. It has the rim of the coffee stains. He wipes his mouth. It's all wrinkled, looks like a shmata. And he starts writing down. He says, when do you think you have money available? You liked my apartment, so let's just talk. If it works out, great. And he starts scribbling down some details, and he writes down, he asks him, when do you think your money will come available? And he says to him, June time seems okay. My money should be coming in from the States. We just sold an apartment. They discuss a payment schedule. He asks him when he would like to receive the apartment. He says, well, my rental agreement is over in April, so maybe that's better. I'm not so sure, but you know what? June should be okay as well. He writes that down. He scribbles some more details, some dates, and some other information. And then he says, your name is Moshe Cohen. I'm not really sure how to spell that. Can you just write your name on the napkin for me? And that may be considered a binding contract according to Israeli law. Okay, there's been a case, a ruling in court that was not very different. Of course, I've stretched it a little bit, but not that much from the situation that occurred. Just be very, very careful. 2 more topics. Representation of both sides. Although it is legal in Israel for a lawyer to represent both the buyer and the seller in a purchase transaction, many times I would advise you to try to avoid this situation. Many times the lawyer will tell you, the first lawyer who you've come to, they'll tell you it's a very simple transaction. There's no need for another lawyer to complicate matters. I'm going to give you a discounted rate. You really don't need it. This is, it's silly to involve anyone else. I think it is almost impossible. It depends on the situation, but there are very few cases where I would advise you to have one lawyer representing both sides. I think that it is almost impossible for a lawyer representing a buyer to represent the seller's interests in the same transaction. Many times there could be simple situations where any slight complications, it's enough that your money doesn't become available to you when you expect it to become available to you. You could have all the right intentions, negotiate exactly what you think the situation is going to be before you sign a contract, but once you sign it, sometimes life is greater, and there are situations where there are changes from what we expect, and you should have a lawyer to represent your interests, and any situation that's a little deviation from the contract may place your lawyer in a situation of conflict of interest. Try to avoid that situation. Now, the last topic I would like to discuss with you is purchase tax. I've prepared a very detailed guide to purchase tax. There are examples in that guide. I think they were all passed around. If not, there are some at the entrance. I suggest that you look through it. There are examples for the different situations. I think it is very clear. There has been a reform in real estate tax in 2014. The current situation is if you purchase a property, you are likely to pay purchase tax. If it's your sole purchase, your first purchase of an apartment, or your only residence, you may have had one and sold one and purchased another one and had one, as long as you're holding on to one apartment, when you purchase that apartment, you're likely to be exempt from tax on the sum of 1,517,210 shekel. Up to that amount, you pay zero tax, and above that amount, you pay a staggered tax on the remainder according to the purchase price that will start at 3.5% all the way to 10%, depending on the price of the property. The tax authorities and the government is trying to control the prices of housing in Israel, and therefore they decided to tax purchases in a hefty manner. So as the more expensive the property, the assumption is the more you're able to pay in taxes. If it is your second home, or any additional home, you'll pay between 5% to 10% tax. That is the taxation. It's a staggered tax. As the price of the property goes up, the taxation goes up. I've given examples in the brochure. For Olim can choose between two scales. They could either decide to use the scale of a first-time purchaser. They can purchase a property even as foreigners, and then they have 2 years to file as first-time purchasers according to the Israeli scale. So as I said, up to 1,517,210 shekel, they will be exempt from tax completely. Above that, they will have to pay by a staggered tax, and that is usually the preferred scale. The other option that Olim have, they have a scale of their own, which is not always worthwhile. In most cases, if you're purchasing your sole apartment, it is not worthwhile using, unless you're purchasing a property above the sum of close to 5 million shekel, 4,800,000 and change. Most Olim, are not in that bracket. So in most cases, it will just pay to purchase and use the scale of the sole purchasers, the first-time purchasers. I would advise you before your purchase to check both scales and see where you stand and take the scale that is best for you. As an Ole, though, if you are purchasing a second residence in Israel, then the purchase tax using the Ole scale is a tremendous benefit. It's a tremendous benefit. You can see the examples that I put in the brochure, and you'll see the difference in prices. So with that, I'd like to conclude that I wish you all a very pleasant experience. Hopefully it'll be worry-free, and it'll be a wonderful experience, and I hope I provided you with pointers so that even I definitely would advise you to have an attorney represent you in the deal, but at least you'll know what to ask, you'll be aware of the issues, and all this is important, and I wish you lots of luck.
So let's start the mortgage portion of the evening, entitled Buying a Home in Israel, and hopefully paying it off before you reach 120. I'll just tell you about myself before we get started. I actually am also a Nefesh B'Nefesh Ola. I made Aliyah about 8.5 years ago. I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh currently with my wife and 5 children. When I started doing these speeches, I only had 1, so I keep adjusting it. But now at Canaan Area, we have 5 children. And I work for a company called Mortgage Israel, and I'm a mortgage broker. And hopefully, I'll be able to help you get started on the mortgage portion of buying a house. Okay. So the Chazal, our sages, tell us that there's 3 things that there's several things that can only be accomplished through challenges, through Yisurin. One of those promises is that acquiring land in Israel is one of those. So it's certainly true. Unfortunately, you'll find when you buy a property there are challenges. Certainly getting a mortgage is part of that, but hopefully what you learn from Debbie and I will help you avoid some of those challenges. Okay. The first step to getting a mortgage is trying to figure out what you can afford. That's really the first step to the home buying process for most people, because if you don't know what you can afford, you can't really start looking for a property. There's 2 considerations there. There's, first of all, how much will the bank lend you, and also how much do you want the bank to lend you. So not necessarily the same thing. The bank might lend you more than your person could really afford, but the bank will typically lend up to 70 or 75% of the purchase price, meaning if a person's buying for $1 million shekel, the bank will give them between 700 and 750,000 shekel. That's for a new olim. For somebody who's buying a second property, or somebody who does not have a Teudat Zehut, I assume everybody here does, but a person who's buying on a passport will be limited to 50% loan to value. The bank will determine a person's qualifications to actually borrowing 75% or whatever they can afford based on their income. So the rule of thumb is typically 3 to 1, meaning that the bank will calculate whatever your mortgage payment is going to be, and they want to see that you're earning at least 3 times that amount net after taxes. And that income will be comprised of a couple of things. They'll want to see your pay stubs, your Tlushe Maskoret. If you're working in Chutz La'aretz, that's fine. Sometimes it's even better. They'll need to show your tax returns or independent audits, depending on the country you come from. If you're of age and you're getting pensions, that's included in your income. If you're in Kollel and you're getting a Kollel stipend, basically every single piece of income that you get can be quantified to make up that 3 times the amount of the mortgage payment to comprise. And everything, the bank will ask for documentation. Obviously, you're getting a mortgage, they want to make sure that you can really afford it. So that's what the bank will lend you. In the past, there was the ability to borrow up to 90 or 95%. Unfortunately, that's just not an option today. So your financing really is limited to that 75%. Now, just because the bank will actually lend you that money doesn't mean that you want to take all of it. Usually, the rule of thumb is take a look at what you're paying rent right now. And that's usually a good starting point. If a person's paying 5,000 shekel rent, that's probably a good indication of what you can afford, but not always. I always tell my clients and everyone I talk to that you're the best judge. You know what you can afford, but typically the bank's 3 to 1 rule is a good idea to hold by. You know, if your mortgage is a third of your income, you're leaving 2/3 of your income to pay the rest of your expenses. That's usually a good rule of thumb. But a person should know themselves or speak to somebody independent to help guide them if they need additional assistance with that. Okay. The difference between the first and subsequent home purchases, I touched on it, is that a person who's buying a first property can borrow up to 75%. A person who's buying a second property or beyond is considered an investor, and as such is only limited to about 50% loan to value. There is some flexibility if a person owns multiple properties. Sometimes the bank will give 50% of each property, but that's something we could discuss on an individual basis, but that's generally the rule of thumb. Okay. Once you figured out what you can afford, it's a good idea to think about everything you know about mortgages from whatever country you come from, and erase all of that, because there's a lot of differences between Israel and the U.S. where I come from and different countries. It's just don't go in with any preconceived notions, and you won't be as disappointed. We'll talk about a couple of major differences, but really we could talk about this for the entire evening. The first major difference is mortgage contingencies. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that means that when you sign a contract in other countries, oftentimes it's assumed that there's a contingency that if you can't get a mortgage or you can't get your financing, that the contract is null and void. In Israel, there's really no such luck. As Debbie mentioned, whatever's in the contract is in the contract. Whatever's not is not. So typically, if you sign a contract without a mortgage contingency, which is very rare in Israel, and you find out a month later that you don't have the financing in place, or you can't get the financing, oftentimes you'll forfeit your down payment, or there could be a significant penalty. So it's always a good idea to get pre-approved and figure out that you have the financing all lined up before you actually sign any contract. Okay, that's one major difference. Another major difference, which is not as significant these days, we'll get into that later on, is variable versus fixed loans. Now, in Chutz La'aretz, I remember when I took a mortgage a decade ago, everyone was doing fixed loans. Most people weren't doing variable loans because the rates weren't worthwhile. Fixed loans have certain benefits in that you're able to budget long term. You know exactly what your payment is. There's no fluctuations. In Israel, it's very common to take a large portion of your loan as a variable loan. There's benefits to it, but there's certainly risks because a variable loan, you don't know long term what you're going to be paying in 3 months, 6 months, a year, and so forth. Okay, the approval percentage, we touched on what you can get here. When I was buying my apartment back in Queens, I remember they were offering me 100, even 105% loan to value. Obviously, it didn't work out so well in the U.S., so it's probably a good reason for Israel not doing it. It's a lot more conservative here, so that's probably a good thing, though. The appraised value, Debbie also mentioned this before, but the appraiser or the assessor, depending on what country you come from, you might call it something else, will tell the banks the value of your property. So if you're buying a property for 2 million shekel, and the appraiser comes and says, because it's not built legally or you're just overpaying for the property, it's actually worth 1.8 million shekel, the bank will only lend you 75% of 1.8 million shekel, not actually off of the 2 million shekel. So there's certain things that it's better to do before you sign a contract. We'll get into that a little bit later, but the appraiser is certainly a good idea if you plan on borrowing the maximum financing. You want to know that you're actually going to be able to get that financing later on. And actually, the appraisers in Israel, it's not uncommon. Sorry, we'll go back to that. The appraisers in Israel, it's not uncommon for it to be underappraised for 10 or even 15% below what you're paying. The appraisers typically are more conservative than you are because they're protecting the bank's interest. So if you really are borrowing the maximum, it's always advisable to do that. Okay, building in the closing costs. Closing costs in Israel can be pretty significant. I used to say that it's anywhere between 5 to 6% of the purchase price. Now with the new tax rates, it might even be more. So before you sign a contract, it's always a good idea to speak to your lawyer, speak to your mortgage broker, make sure you calculate exactly what the closing costs are, so that way you've budgeted it. And you don't want to buy a property and then realize you've run out of money for all of the closing costs. It's not going to be a good situation. Okay. Mortgage options and terms. If you go online, you could find there's probably about 50 different loan options in Israel. So loan number one, no, I'm just kidding. We won't go through all 50 different loan options because it'll just bog you down. We'll just talk about some of the major, some of the main products that are available. There's dollar or dollar-linked loans. Generally speaking, when choosing your mortgage, you want to try and choose a mortgage that matches your income. So if you come from the UK and you're getting a pension in sterling, or you come from the US and your income is still dollar-based, it's always advisable to take a loan that matches your income. It takes out the currency risk. If you take a shekel-based loan and you're earning dollars, you're going to have fluctuation between how many dollars are going to make up your shekel payment. So there's options, not just in dollar, but there's sterling options, euro options, Canadian dollar options, pretty much any major currency that somebody's going to be earning income in. There are typically options that match that. Shekel options. There's a lot of different shekel options, which makes sense because we live in Israel. Within the shekel options, there are a lot of pitfalls. So the most common loan in Israel is actually a shekel-based loan that's linked to inflation. It's called a tzamud l'madad loan. It's the most common loan. However, it's also the most dangerous loan. It's a loan that has two variables. It has the interest rate, and it also has the inflation rate, which means that a person is borrowing 1 million shekel for 30 years. Okay, after the first year, they've paid off, let's say, 20,000 shekel. So now their balance is now 980,000 shekel. the bank will actually adjust your 980,000 shekel at the end of the year and say that's what it was worth at the beginning of the year. But now, because of inflation, your 980,000 shekel is actually worth 1,010,000 shekel. So a person could be paying off this loan for the first 10 or 15 years of the term, only to find that they haven't gotten anywhere, or that they actually owe more halfway through the loan than when they started the loan. So my point is just do your research, speak to the banks, speak to a mortgage broker, speak to people who can guide you to really understand. Don't just say, well, I'm earning shekels, this is a shekel option, this is, the bank is offering me this loan, it sounds great. You really have to understand exactly what you're getting into. Okay, foreign currency. I mentioned this, the foreign currency loans, a couple of years ago, I would say about 5 years ago, the quote-unquote in loan was people were taking Japanese yen loans. The Japanese yen, the interest rates were very cheap. They were at around 2% for probably almost 10 years. So many people were opting for the Japanese yen loan, figuring, okay, the interest rate is so cheap, let me take advantage. What they were ignoring is that most people, I think I've done one Japanese yen loan with somebody who was actually earning Japanese yen. Most people are not earning that currency. When you do that, you can end up losing a significant amount of money, where you might start, your payments are $1,000 in Japanese yen equivalent, only to find that the yen strengthened versus the dollar and your payment has gone up 70%. Not quite, but it went up about 40% for some people. So my point is that if you're going to be opting for a loan that's in a currency you're not familiar with, it's probably not a good idea to do it, because you don't want to have to tell your wife you have to move out because you took a Japanese yen loan. But it is an option, it's a viable option, but you have to understand what you're doing before you jump into it. Okay, there are fixed and variable loans. Without bogging you down too much, the Bank of Israel has taken a bunch of measures to try and stabilize mortgages. Okay, they looked around the world and saw that there were various real estate bubbles where people took variable loans and the interest rates shot up, and you had a whole bunch of people defaulting on loans, particularly in the US, but in certain other countries that was the case as well. To avoid that, the Bank of Israel has decided that any person with a Teudat Zehut, any Israeli buying a property, needs to take 2/3 of any loan has to be fixed. So there's certainly benefits to that, in that you're able to budget for a good portion of your mortgage. The downside is fixed rates are typically 3 or 4% higher than variable loans. So your payments might be higher, but it's really a double-edged sword. Oftentimes people will decide to take a variable loan for 1/3 of the loan, because that way your final 1/3 of the loan, you can at least bring your payments down somewhat. It's a way to budget a little bit better. There's pros and cons, and it's certainly something to be discussed on a one-to-one basis, but it certainly is an option. Now, terms. Typically, the banks will lend up until the age of 75 years old. Now, that doesn't mean only until 75, although for many banks that's the case. There are certain exceptions. Okay, so typically you want to only take a loan till you're 75, but there's certain banks that, I got a 67-year-old a 30-year loan just 2 weeks ago. So it is possible, it is an option. Banks typically want to know why. If you're 75 years old and you're borrowing 75% of a property, they're going to ask a lot of questions and find out, but it's certainly something that there is potential. Also, sometimes banks will decide, if you are 70 years old and you're willing to put a younger person as a co-signer, whether they have income or not, sometimes that will be a way to extend the loan. So if you're 70 years old and you've got a child who's 40 and they're willing to go onto the mortgage as a co-signer, sometimes that's a way of extending the loan beyond the age of 75 as well. Okay, fixed versus variable loans. We've spoken about this a little bit. The fixed loans certainly offer you some security, in that you're able to budget the mortgage payments that you're going to have. One major difference between fixed loans in Israel and fixed loans in Chutz La'aretz is that fixed loans in Israel have prepayment penalties, or the potential for prepayment penalties. So if you go to pay off your loan, you take a fixed loan for 30 years and 5 years into the loan you want to pay it off, the bank will calculate, okay, where were the interest rates when you took out the loan? Where are the interest rates now? If we're going to take your money back and have to lend it to Moshe Cohn at a lower interest rate, we're going to be losing money, then they're going to charge you that difference as a prepayment penalty. So it's just be aware when you're buying a property, and you're taking a fixed loan, that if you're going to pay it off early, you might end up have some penalties to adjust to. Okay. Fixed loans, are they really fixed? So you might have heard from your neighbors or your friends that there's no such thing as a fixed loan in Israel. Today that's not the case. There are true fixed rate loans. The times when people tell you it's not really fixed is when it's a loan that's linked to inflation, like I mentioned before. If you go into the bank and ask the bank for a loan, they're going to tell you, okay, we've got a great loan. It's a shekel loan. It's 2.5% for 30 years fixed. And most people sign up to that loan because it sounds too good to be true, which, as the saying goes, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. That's typically the inflation-based loan. The Madad, inflation, is about 3 to 4% a year. So a person who's taking a 2.5% fixed loan really has to assume their true rate is about 5.5 or 6% and not really 2.5%. So it's always better to clarify what fixed actually means, not just reading the label and assuming that's the case. Okay, what if you move or if you sell your house? So these penalties don't apply. Any mortgage you take can typically be moved onto a new property. So if you're a young couple and you buy a starter property and 5 years from now you've outgrown it and you want to move on to a property that's a little bit bigger, or you just want to move communities, you can take your mortgage onto the new property. Typically, if you're not moving from Jerusalem to the West Bank, typically you can move the mortgage relatively easily. And if you do, it's just a process, but it's not considered paying off your mortgage and starting anew, so you don't have to worry about those penalties we mentioned. Okay, deciding on the mortgage. We touched on this a little bit already, but the currency of income, as I said, you want to try and keep your mortgage based on the whatever currency you're earning. You want to try and get a loan that matches that currency. Now and in the future, a person who just made Aliyah and is still getting an income from their home country, from the UK, if you know that it's a short-term project and you're going to be switching to a shekel income in a year or two, it might not make sense to take a loan just in that currency. So it's a good idea to really take a look at the long term. What income am I going to be earning, and that way you can determine what mortgage to take. Sometimes there's different strategies to taking a mortgage as well. If a person is 60 years old and they're buying a property, and they know they're going to be working for the next 5 years or 10 years and then planning on retiring, sometimes it's a good idea to front load your mortgage. Try and take a bigger portion where your payments are going to be larger for the first bunch of years while you're still working. And that way, once you retire, hopefully your payments will drop off. You've paid off a large part of the mortgage. Or vice versa. A young couple might decide to take a loan that the payments are shorter in the beginning with the intention of refinancing and shortening the term later on once they've got a higher income. That's more the payment strategy that I just mentioned, and that you want to just try and take a look at your situation. Everybody has a different situation. You have to really put some foresight into it. If you go into the bank and you just ask for a loan, the average banker isn't equipped. They're not paid enough. They're not trained enough to really help you go through these strategies. So it's a good idea to really speak to your advisors or whoever it is that's consulting you, and that way you'll be able to get a better idea of what strategy will work for you. Hedging yourself. Oftentimes it's a good idea to try and mix different products. Again, I'm not going to get into it too much, but there's different strategies where, if your wife is earning dollars and you're earning shekels, you might want to take a part dollar loan, a part shekel loan, or various different combinations of such. You might be able to hedge yourself by taking different products, and that way you're really going to balance out your mortgage long term. Penalties we've spoken about already at length, but just be clear, whenever you get an approval from the bank, whenever you're sitting down and taking a mortgage, ask what are the penalties, and then ask what are the fees, because the banks don't necessarily associate them the same. They might say there's no penalties, but there's major fees for closing off a mortgage. Just make sure that you understand exactly what the costs are going to be long term for the products you're taking. Okay, Olim benefits. Benefits, unfortunately, probably the entire title should be in quotation marks. Unfortunately, the benefits are not so significant these days for getting a mortgage as an Olah. Sorry, Miriam. But there's the first benefit is the preferred rates. Now, the preferred rates that Olim get is something called zakaut. A person who makes Aliyah is entitled to, based on a point system between where you're buying, Army service, number of children, various factors like that will determine how many points you get, and that will determine how much you get for your zakaut. Now, the zakaut portion of the mortgage is a loan that you get at what's called a discounted rate. Now, this discounted rate is a loan that's linked to inflation. As I mentioned to you, you could get the inflation-linked loan if you go into the bank for about 2.5% today. The Olim loan is 3%. So it's a preferred rate. It's not really a benefit. Sometimes the only time that people really use this loan is if you want to get 75%. Oftentimes the bank will only give you 75% if you're taking the zakaut. So aside from that, pretty much nobody takes the zakaut, but it is technically a benefit that's available to Olim within 10 years of Aliyah. Excuse me, and it's only available once. So if you buy one property and 5 years later you sell a property and need to redo your mortgage, you can't take the zakaut a second time if you wanted to. The discounted tax rate, as Debbie mentioned, the tax laws just changed. There's a very, very rare instance when the Olim benefit pays off. I think it's somewhere over 4 million shekel or so, but your lawyer or Debbie can certainly tell you when that barrier is, when it pays to use the rate that you get for making Aliyah. Okay, closing costs. Now, you obviously want to make sure that you pay attention to all of the closing costs, because you don't want to find at the end of the home purchase that you don't have money for the various costs. If you go through a realtor, through a real estate agent, typically real estate agents in Israel take money from the buyer and the seller. They ask for 2% plus VAT. Having been here for 8 years, I'll give you a little tip in that if you ask for a discount on things, sometimes you get it. If you don't ask for a discount, nobody will ever offer it to you. So real estate agents will always ask for 2%. They usually don't expect it. You can always ask for a discount, ask for 1%, 1.5%. Sometimes ask them to include VAT in their fee, but that is the first cost you'll have if you go through a real estate agent. The next cost you'll have is a lawyer. Now, sometimes, as Debbie mentioned, people will decide not to take a lawyer, will decide to share a lawyer to save a fee. Pretty much not coming from a legal standpoint, coming as a person who's been involved in hundreds of deals over the last bunch of years, I can tell you the lawyer is more important than the mortgage broker, is more important than the real estate agent, is the most important person. Make sure you choose a lawyer who's really going to represent you. I've worked with Debbie many times. Debbie is a phenomenal lawyer, but whoever you work with, make sure that they come with a very good reputation and you get really comfortable. Your lawyer will usually take about 1% of the purchase price. There are lawyers that will charge less, that will charge 0.5%. You get what you pay for. So, sometimes the lawyers that work for less, there's a reason they work for less. Just do your homework. When you're trying to save money on costs, just make sure that the lawyer is not the one person that you're trying to save money on, because that's the person who could really save you a significant amount of money. Okay, purchase tax. Again, you want to make sure that you've calculated your purchase tax. Your lawyer will be able to calculate exactly how much that is. Before you sign a contract, make sure you know exactly how much tax you're going to have to budget. The engineer. Now, an engineer is non-obligatory, but it probably should be. The engineer is going to take a look at your property and tell you what the flaws are, and you do this before you've signed the contract. That way, your lawyer can put into the contract that the seller has to fix X, Y, and Z. I could tell you story after story of what engineers have found, even on brand new properties. I had a person who bought a property on paper. Before he moved in, I told him to get an engineer. He said, but it's a brand new property, what could be wrong? Those are kind of famous last words in Israel. He found that 2 of his rooms were not the size in the contract, and one of the walls, even though to the naked eye you couldn't tell, was actually on a 25% angle. So things that you would never imagine in a million years, the engineer will pick up. Engineers typically, it depends on the area that you're buying. The engineer's cost will be different, but assume about 2,500 shekel for the engineer. It's also money well spent, and it's highly advisable. The appraiser. So the appraiser, if you do it once you've signed a contract, so then the fee for the appraiser is cheaper because you're going through the bank's negotiated rates. If you do it before you sign a contract, appraisers will typically take somewhere about 2,000 shekel, 2,500 shekel, as opposed to after you've signed the contract, it's about 1,000 shekel. again, the engineer and the appraiser you want to do before you sign a contract, so that way you know exactly what you're getting into, the quality of the building and the value that the appraiser is going to tell the bank they could lend against. That's obviously very important. The origination fee. When you're borrowing money from the banks charge you what's called the ptichat tik fee, the bank origination fee, which is just for opening a file. They charge you something so they can make a little bit extra profit. They charge you for being able to process the file. Typically, the origination fee is 0.25% of the mortgage. Banks don't expect to actually charge you 0.25% of the mortgage unless you don't ask for a discount. If you ask them for less than 0.25%, then typically you'll get that. But it is something that's negotiable typically. Okay. Registration costs. When you're buying a property, there's various registration costs. You'll have to give a power of attorney to the bank. You'll have to register a lien on the property. There's just certain steps that are taking in order to complete the mortgage. Those registration costs come out to usually 1,000 shekel. Usually a little bit less, but let's assume 1,000 shekel for our purposes. Okay. Mortgage broker. This is where I actually have to pitch my services, but obviously, mortgage broker is not mandatory, probably should be, but your mortgage broker is there my job there is to guide you through the process. I'm completely unbiased, whereas if you go to the bank will tell you the best product probably for them. They're not necessarily going to guide you in your specific situation. The mortgage broker is there to really sit down, figure out your situation, come out with the best plan on how to get you the best mortgage, the most affordable mortgage. Typically your mortgage broker, I find I save my clients, I make up my fee within the first 2 to 3 years of the mortgage and savings that I get based on the intangibles of picking the right product, and I just get better rates than the average person because of the volume of business I do. Mortgage brokers, I charge 1% of the mortgage for our services, plus VAT. Unfortunately, can't get around that. The VAT, no, but it's a good question. The VAT is the value-added tax. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody ask. That's 18% in Israel. Okay, the last closing cost is the conversion of funds. Okay, Debbie touched on it a little bit, but always bear in mind that when you're bringing money from whatever country you're coming from, typically you're going to have to convert that into shkalim. If you go through the banks usually charge about 1.25% to 1.5% of the amount you're bringing over to receive the money, convert it, and send it out. If you go through a foreign exchange company, that's how my company started off. We've got a foreign exchange division. Typically the cost is 0.65 to 0.75%, depending on how much you're wiring over. So you could save about $800 per 100,000 you're sending over by going through a foreign exchange company rather than going through the bank. Okay, so foreign exchange, when will you need to bring over money? Typically you'll need to bring it over for your down payment. If you're going to be bringing money over from 3 or 4 different places, right, if you've got different accounts or it's coming, please God, hopefully from different relatives who are helping out. Unfortunately, I didn't have that. It's a good idea to put all of your money into one account in the US, or sorry, that's my standard, or in the UK, or wherever you're coming from, and then wire it over all at once to Israel. Most banks will charge you an international wiring fee, usually anywhere between $40 to $50. So if you can put it all in one account and then send it over at once, you'll save on the additional costs. Monthly expenses, again, if a person's earning income or getting support from abroad, you might need to bring over your monthly expenses. It's something I could talk about on an individual basis, but again, going through a foreign exchange company, you'll save on that a lot more than going through the bank. Okay, using an Israeli bank, we spoke about that a little bit, but one of the other advantages to going through a foreign exchange company versus a bank is that a Forex company will typically be able to turn it over a lot quicker. Sometimes when you wire money through the bank, it could take up to a week to get your funds. Through a foreign exchange company, it's usually the next day. So it's a little bit quicker and hopefully cheaper as well. Okay, additional monthly costs to budget. You'll want to budget, obviously, your mortgage payment. That's a significant payment. Insurance. Okay. In Israel, 2 types of insurances are obligatory to your mortgage. Okay. The first insurance is life insurance. When a person takes out a mortgage, both parties have to take out life insurance. So if you're a little bit older, if you're taking a larger mortgage, it could be something that's costly. It's always a good idea to shop around a little bit. The banks will always encourage you to use their insurance company. Sometimes it's easier for them. I always encourage people to find a broker, because if you ever actually need to make a claim, hopefully not on life insurance, but on structure insurance, which is the other insurance, it's always good to have an agent who is there to represent you and not just a number from the bank to call. Okay, the other insurance is structure insurance. So you need life insurance and structure. That structure will cover the property itself. If there's an earthquake or a fire or a burst pipe or anything that can happen within the four walls of the house, the structure insurance will cover that. The bank makes it mandatory because they want to know that if there's a fire and it burns down your apartment, that you'll actually have an apartment to move back into, because otherwise you're going to stop paying your mortgage. So it's obvious why they'll do that. Not mandatory insurance is homeowners insurance, property insurance that actually protects your contents. Sometimes people overlook this. It's not mandatory, but it's a good idea to make sure that when you're getting other insurances that you're also protecting your clothes, your electronics, your jewelry, whatever else is inside, and not the four walls of the property. Okay. You also want to budget property tax, Arnona, which if you're renting, you're probably paying Arnona now, but it's just something to bear in mind that that is an additional cost you're going to have. Vad Bayit, if you're living in a building or in a complex, typically there's an additional fee for living in a property called Vad Bayit. It's the maintenance fee, the upkeep, pays for the cleaner, the elevator, snow removal if that's applicable, as it was a couple of months ago. But it pays for the upkeep and maintenance of the building. It's something to bear in mind. It's typically, depends on the project, if there's an elevator or not, anywhere between 50 to 200 shekel per month you'd pay in Vad Bayit. Unless you're talking about some of the more luxury properties, and that's there's always an exception to the rule. Okay, if you buy a property and you rent it out, a lot of these fees won't apply. You don't have to pay the Arnona. Your renters will pay that. Your Vad Bayit also won't be paid. The only thing you'll really be paying is your mortgage payment and your insurance cost. So obviously renting out has its advantages, but then you got to rent somewhere, so it doesn't always work. Okay. I've given you a pretty good overview of mortgages, I think. Now let's talk about, I want to buy a property. What are the steps I need to take practically to getting started? The first step is getting pre-approved. If you're just getting started and you want to see what can I afford, the first step is going to the bank, going through a mortgage broker, whoever it is, and making sure you get pre-approval so you know exactly what you can afford. Otherwise, you could just be wasting time looking around for a property. The documents needed, we'll need to show all income documents. If you're working here in Israel, you'll need to show 3 months of pay stubs. If you're working abroad, then they'll want to see tax returns or self-assessment forms, wherever you're coming from, for 2 years. And that will serve as the income verification. If you're learning in Kollel, you get a letter from the Kollel. If you're getting pensions, they'll want to see your Social Security statement or your pension statement from wherever you're coming from. They'll want to see bank statements. Now, in Israel, and we're getting there slowly, we're getting to be more of a centralized process, but there isn't really any credit checking in Israel. There's a very primitive way that the banks check, but not really. So the way they check your credit is they ask for bank statements. So they'll want to see 3 months of bank statements from your Israeli account, on the assumption that if you're not bouncing any checks or harat kevas in your bank statement, then you probably will pay your mortgage for the next 30 years. It's a little bit ridiculous, but that's the thought process. I've had clients who came to me with 10 bounced payments, and I say, don't do anything for the next 3 months. Come back to me and we'll reapply. You go to the bank, so the banks are happy. They don't know the difference. If you are coming from abroad, typically they won't want to see a credit score, but that's only if you're earning income from abroad. So if you came from America and you stopped paying your student loans and your credit's in the 600s, the 500s, the only time the bank will ever ask for your credit score is if you're still claiming income from Chutz La'aretz. If your income is all shekel based, you don't really have to worry about it anymore. There are ways around a bad credit score getting a mortgage anyway, but it is something they typically ask for. And they'll obviously want to see your Teudat Zahut and your IDs, or if you're not Israeli, they'll want to see passports and driver's licenses. If you're not working in Israel, again, it's not necessarily a problem. They'll just want to verify where your income is coming from. The banks understand that, they understand 1040s or P60s or T1s, wherever you're coming from. It's just a matter of verifying your income. As long as you can do that satisfactorily, the banks are happy. Typically, they like working with people with foreign incomes because on average, you're going to have a higher income when you're coming from Chutz La'aretz or when you have Chutz La'aretz income. Okay, a person who can't qualify for a loan, they don't have the 3-to-1 or the age doesn't qualify them for the loan, the banks will accept co-signers. Nowadays, using a co-signer is a little bit more difficult than it was in the past. Typically, the only co-signers that are acceptable are family members, close family members, a parent, a child, a sibling, sometimes a cousin, but the banks usually understand that a cousin doesn't necessarily mean a cousin. It could be an 18th cousin. Co-signers typically need to be family, and they typically have to be Israeli. Okay, so again, that's most banks. There are some banks that we could still push through mortgages for people who are using co-signers from Chutz La'aretz, but I'm giving you generalities. For specifics, we can speak afterwards. Okay, your pre-approval is valid for 90 days. Okay, so 3 months from the time we have a pre-approval is the bank will guarantee the mortgage. If it's longer than that, let's say you're looking for a property but you just don't know how long it's going to take you to find, it's still worthwhile to get pre-approved at the very beginning. Once you've gotten a pre-approval, to get it extended is generally very easy. The banks will just want to see updated income and bank statements to make sure your credit is still good. Okay, once you've gotten pre-approved, now you're ready to start looking for a property. Now, there's a couple of different ways to find a property. Either go through a real estate agent. The benefit is the real estate agent typically knows the area better, will have a lot more options. The downside is that you end up paying the real estate agent their commission. Speak to friends, or you could check websites, check the newspaper. There's a bunch of different ways to look for properties. These are just a couple of them. Okay? So now you've gotten your mortgage, you found a property. Now is the time to find a lawyer. As I said before, lawyers is one of the most important steps you're going to find. So make sure you have a lawyer who speaks both your language and speaks your language. So what I mean by that is make sure they understand that you want a certain level of service, and then it's not going to be communications just via email. And when you're dealing with a property, you want somebody who actually speaks English, hopefully, because that way you're going to be able to communicate precisely. You don't want to have anything lost in translation between you and your lawyer. Make sure you have that comfort level. So sometimes it pays to speak to more than one lawyer. Just make sure whoever you're dealing with, you've got a comfort level that they're actually taking care of you. You could ask for referrals from the lawyer, or you can ask friends who have bought for referral. As Debbie mentioned, make sure you deal only with a real estate lawyer. Real estate lawyers, there's a reason why they specialize in just real estate. Make sure that you're not taking a family friend or a neighbor just because they're a lawyer, even if they're not a real estate lawyer. Language barrier, as I said, just make sure that there is no language barrier. If you're buying from abroad, or for whatever reason you're not able to make it to the bank, if you're whatever it is, you can give power of attorney to your lawyer or to somebody else to sign on everything from you. If you're buying from Chutz La'aretz, you don't ever have to physically be in Israel to buy the property. You can do everything through power of attorney or through the consulate in whatever country you are. Okay. Now you've got the property, you've gotten your mortgage, you've decided on a lawyer. The lawyer will typically take between a week to 10 days between the two lawyers to negotiate a contract. During that time, it's a good idea to hire the engineer to see if there's any structural damage or any reason that you don't want to continue buying the property. Do the appraisal so that way you know exactly what the bank is going to be lending you. Show registration documents to the bank. It's always a good idea, once the lawyers are working on everything, to get the land registry documents, show it to the bank, have them check it out. This especially applies if you're buying in somewhere that's not Jerusalem, Beit Shemesh, Modi'in. We're going to hold questions until the end. I have somebody who's buying right now in Kiryat Arba. The way they register properties there is very different than in a bunch of different areas. If you're buying in somewhere that's not a typical place, it's always a good idea, but specifically then to show any of the land registry documents to the bank, so that way they've approved both your income and the property, so there won't be any nasty surprises down the road. The time frame, as I said, it usually takes a week or 10 days for the lawyers to come up with a contract. To get funding from the bank usually takes about 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks to get funding, so your lawyer should build that into the contract. Okay. The signing and closing, right now you're ready to actually sign. You don't have to be in Israel, as I mentioned. You could do everything from Chutz La'aretz. The signing itself, doesn't take very long, but to actually take possession, usually it's not going to be less than 4 weeks. Sometimes the whole contract process will take up to 6 months. It really depends on the needs of the buyer and the seller. If the seller is moving or whatever it is, that's something that's always negotiable between the lawyers and between the buyer and the seller. When can you be sure it's yours? So unlike in the US where I come from, where you're not really sure it's yours until the final closing when you actually have the keys in your hand, in Israel, once you've signed the contract, 99% of the time it's your property. Nothing is going to happen. In the 8 years I've been doing this, I've only had one contract fall through after it was signed. It's very rare, so if you're not into Ayin Haras, as soon as you sign a contract, you can start telling people you bought. If you are, then you can wait until the closing. But that's it. We're going to take questions now. I'll just make one offer to everyone here or anybody who's listening on online. Anybody who's interested, I give free consultations. So anyone who wants to speak to me either now or my business cards all around, feel free to be in touch, and I'm happy to give a consultation.